back. I'm Kip Davis. I'm a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is the third video in my series examining Richard Carrier's understanding and presentation of Jewish literature as it appears in his book on the Historicity of Jesus, Chapter 4, Background Knowledge. This is a departure from my usual presentations in which I deal with texts more closely related to the Hebrew Bible generally and to early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you haven't done so already, maybe check out my ongoing series, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Unapologetically. This is the third video in my series examining Richard Carrier's understanding and presentation of Jewish literature as it appears in Chapter 4 of his book on the Historicity of Jesus. The title of the chapter is Background Knowledge. And here, Carrier lays out a series of essential elements of information that he sees as necessary to the emergence of Christianity. So, in the last video, we showed that Carrier believes some pre-Christian Jews expected the death of their anticipated Messiah by conflating scriptures from Isaiah 52 to 53 and Daniel chapter 9. He imagines a Son of God who is despised, killed, resurrected, and crowned as a king of heaven by misreading basic syntax in the Wisdom of Solomon, and then a messenger whose death on the final day of atonement would absolve the sins of all the elect and institute God's rule by misunderstanding how to reconstruct the fragmentary Dead Sea Scrolls text 11Q Melchizedek, and by miscomprehending how Jewish scripture exegesis even works. In this final video, I'm going to move on from Carrier's element 5, which we covered in the last two, to element 6, where he attempts, poorly, to comprehend the biblical book of Zechariah and the Qumran Aramaic so-called Son of God text 4Q 246. As a reminder, I am not critiquing Carrier's minimal Jesus myth theory. Rather, this is a quality review of specifically this one chapter in his book, Chapter 4, through which we're going to continue to ask the same questions. Does he read and represent this literature well? And is this book a good source for Second Temple Judaism? So, let's start by reviewing Carrier's element 6 before diving into the texts. Zechariah chapter 3 and 6, and the Son of God text, 4Q 246 from Qumran. The suffering and dying servant of Isaiah 52 to 53, and the Messiah of Daniel 9, which per the previous element, may already have been seen by some Jews as the same person. These have numerous logical connections with a man in Zechariah 3 and 6 named Jesus Rising, who is confronted by Satan in God's abode in heaven, and their crowned king, given all of God's authority, holds the office of high priest and will build up God's house, which is how Christians described their church. Carrier begins his discussion of element 6 like this. In the Septuagint text, Zechariah is commanded in a vision to place the crown of kingship upon Jesus in Zechariah chapter 6 verse 11, and to say immediately upon doing so that Jehovah declares that this Jesus is the man named Rising, and he shall rise up from his place below, and he shall build the house of the Lord. The key noun is Anatole, which is often translated east because it refers to where the sun rises, hence east. But such a translation obscures the fact that the actual word used is the noun rising or rise, as in sunrise, which was not always used in reference to a compass point, and whose real connotations are more obvious when translated literally. In fact, by immediately using the cognate verb to rise up, anatele, and that explicitly from his place below, it's clear the Septuagint translator understood the word to mean rise. And Philo echoes the same pun in his interpretation and thus also understood. We know Zechariah meant this in some way to be Jesus ben Jehozadak, the legendary first high priest of the Second Temple. But by implying this event may have occurred in heaven, interpreters could think differently. And we know that some did. Right from the start, I'm going to point out that in this video, I'm not going to be talking about Philo. And the reason for that is because I think it's enough to just focus on the text of Zechariah, which Carrier gets just dead wrong. And as a result of this error, he completely misunderstands or erroneously then overreads Philo's midrash on this text, which appears in his On the Confession of Tongues 62. So there are several problems with his handling of this text. First, because this is something that Carrier has a tendency not to do, let's take a look at the text itself. Zechariah chapter 6, starting in verse 9 to 13, says this: "The word of Yahweh came to me. Take from the exiles, take Hildai, Tobiah, and Yediah, those who came from Babylon, and you proceed that same day to the house of Josiah, son of Zephaniah. Take silver and gold and make crowns. Place on the head of Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and say to him, Thus said Yahweh Tsabaoth." This is Yahweh of armies or Yahweh of hosts. "See the man. His name is Branch. From out of his place he shall build the temple of Yahweh. He shall build the temple of Yahweh and will attain majesty. He shall sit and rule on his throne. There will also be a priest seated on his throne, and counsel of peace shall prevail between the two of them." So Zechariah is a text that was written sometime shortly after the reconstruction of the Jerusalem temple, the second temple by Zerubbabel. And has happened sometime probably near the beginning of the 6th century. So the scene in view here happens prior to the construction of the temple, in which Zechariah the prophet is speaking directly to the high priest, Yehoshua, or Joshua, and he tells him about this figure he identifies as Branch, and identifies this man as the one who's going to rebuild the temple. And we know that figure was Zerubbabel. Now, Carrier seems to think that the Septuagint translation, this is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was compiled at some time in the 3rd century BCE. Carrier thinks that the Septuagint translation of this text is particularly important to his ideas about this cosmic messianic figure that he described above. Let's take a look at the Septuagint translation of this passage I just read from Zechariah 6, verses 9 to 13. And this is my adapted version of the English translation that appears in the New English translation of the Septuagint. "And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Take the things from captivity, and the rulers, and from its useful people, and from those who are familiar with it. And you shall enter in that day into the house of Josiah, son of Sophonias, who has come from Babylon. And you shall take silver and gold and make crowns, and set on the head of the great high priest, Jesus, son of Josadak. And you shall say to him, This is what the Lord Almighty says, Behold, a man, shoot," or another translation for this word is dawn, "is his name, and he shall sprout from below him, and shall build the house of the Lord. And it is he that shall receive virtue, and shall sit and rule on his throne. And the priest shall be on his right, and peaceful counsel shall be between the two of them." So first, Carrier draws attention to this word in Greek, Anatole, which was translated by the Netz translator as shoot or possibly dawn. Now, Carrier's right in pointing out that the general meaning of this word is rising, but his implication that this is clearly a rise from death is certainly not what the Septuagint translator had in view here. In Hebrew, the word is tzemach, and it means sprouting, or seedling, or branch. It comes from the root tzemach, meaning to grow, and frequently it's translated with cognates of anatello, which is the same Greek word that Anatole comes from. This verb means to rise or to grow, and you see several examples of this usage throughout the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 2 verse 5, or Leviticus 13:37, Deuteronomy 29:22, and I've supplied a few other examples here on the screen. So obviously, the translators of the Septuagint are not attempting to supply new meaning to the Hebrew text here. This is just an ordinary way of retranslating this word. It should be understood in this text, in this translation, as seedling, or more idiomatically as scion, as translated by Carol and Eric Myers, who wrote an excellent commentary on the text of Zechariah. So by ignoring the broader usage of this fairly flexible word throughout the Septuagint, Carrier is being a little bit misleading in his treatment of this passage. You'll notice he doesn't ever inform his readers that this is a common way by which this word tzemach in Hebrew, which just means seedling, is translated. Secondly, I think Carrier is very clearly misreading this text by asserting that Joshua, the high priest, is the man named Rising. He is not. You'll notice in the text, Yahweh is speaking to Joshua, the high priest, through Zechariah. But then when Zechariah is instructed to say to Joshua, "See, a man named Scion, or branch, shall grow out from his place and will build the temple of Yahweh," he's not saying this to Joshua of himself. He is clearly referring here to Zerubbabel, not Joshua. Third, while a little confusing, it also seems clear here that the crown of kingship is not Joshua's, but rather Zerubbabel. You will notice in this text very clearly there are two crowns. You see it in verse 11, and you see it again in verse 14, and there's two recipients. Explicitly, in verse 13, it says, "He," that is referring to Scion or Zerubbabel, "shall build the house of the Lord." And that's what Zerubbabel did. It continues and says, "And it is he that shall receive virtue and shall sit and rule on his throne. And then the priest," that's Joshua, "shall be on his right, and peaceful counsel shall be between the two of them." If anything, the Greek translation of this text actually clarifies the fact that there are two people in view here. Scion is Zerubbabel. Yehoshua, the priest, is separate from him. By conflating and misunderstanding what's going on in this text, Carrier then is misrepresenting what the text is about. There is no Jesus rising because Yehoshua is not the one identified as Scion. That's Zerubbabel. There's a Zerubbabel rising. But that doesn't fit with Carrier's larger projection of what he thinks is going on in this text. So Carrier then continues, "If this Jesus rising were connected to the dying servant who atones for all sins in Isaiah, and perhaps also with Daniel or 11Q13, it would be easy to read out of this almost the entire core Christian gospel. Connecting the two figures in just that way would be natural to do. This same Jesus, who is named Rising, or in both places branch in the extant Hebrew, as in the Davidic heir, or so both contexts imply, this appears earlier in Zechariah 3, where Jesus is also implied to be the one called Rising in chapter 3, verse 8. Both are also called Jesus the high priest throughout Zechariah 3 and 6, hence clearly the same person. And there he is also called God's servant. And it is said that through him, in some unspecified way, all the sin in the world would be cleansed in a single day, citing Zechariah 3 verse 9. Again, it's important to return and look carefully at the actual text, because this is something that Carrier consistently never does. The Septuagint translation of Zechariah chapter 3, starting in verse 6, reading through to verse 10, says this, And the angel of the Lord bore witness to Jesus, saying, This is what the Lord Almighty says. If you walk in my ways and keep my ordinances, then you shall judge my house. And if you carefully guard my court, then I will give you men who dwell among these who stand by. Now listen, Jesus, great priest, you and your colleagues who sit before you, for the men are diviners. For behold, I bring forth my slave, or my servant, Shoot, or Dawn. For the stone which I have set before Jesus, on the one stone are 7 eyes. Behold, I am digging a hole, says the Lord Almighty, and I will search out all the injustice of the land in one day. On that day, says the Lord Almighty, you shall invite each his neighbor under the vine and under the fig tree. As noted, this same Jesus is not the one named Rising. This is Zerubbabel, not the high priest Joshua. Not clearly the same person at all. Zerubbabel is the one who's called Yahweh's slave or his servant in this text, but this is an ubiquitous term. It appears all over the Hebrew Bible. Elsewhere, it's applied to royal messianic figures, such as in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 9, and 27, verse 6, with reference to Nebuchadnezzar, who is identified as Yahweh's servant or his slave. But also take a look at Haggai chapter 2, verse 23. It says this, On that day, an oracle of Yahweh Sabaoth, I will take you, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, my servant, or my slave. I will make you like a signet, for I have chosen you, an oracle of Yahweh Sabaoth. Haggai is a contemporary prophecy of Zechariah. Carol and Eric Myers, who have written an excellent commentary on both Haggai and Zechariah together, the first half of Zechariah, they actually argue that these two texts were edited and published together. And very clearly within Haggai, Zerubbabel is the one who is explicitly identified as the slave of Yahweh. And here in the text of Zechariah chapter 3, where Yahweh identifies Branch, his slave, this is obviously about Zerubbabel, not Yehoshua or Joshua the high priest. But that's not all. From there, Carrier goes on to mistranslate and by extension then to misunderstand verse 9. Yahweh says exclusively, I will remove the iniquity of this land in one day. The Septuagint translates this, I will search out all the unrighteousness of that land in one day. You'll notice there is no cleansing from sin here. Neither the word sin nor the word cleanse actually appears in this text at all. You'll also notice that the text is very specific about the exclusivity of this object. This is to occur in this land, not all the sin in the world. This is just sloppy reading. Joshua's connection to Yahweh's activity in this text is not clearly spelled out, but I think importantly, Yahweh is the one who is pictured removing iniquity in this text, not Joshua. The text says clearly the stone with 7 eyes, this is the instrument of Yahweh's actions, shall be on his forehead continuously to win their favor before Yahweh. This is most likely the gemstone that's attached to the turban of the high priest that we read of in Exodus chapter 28, verses 36 to 38. So no, neither is all the sin in the entire world cleansed in a single day in this passage in Zechariah chapter 3. It's also not clearly happening because of Joshua. The attention is focused on the stone that's on his turban. Carrier then continues. As I mentioned, an exoteric reading of Zechariah 3 and 6 would conclude the author originally meant the first high priest of the second temple, Jesus ben Yehozadak. He cites Zechariah 6:11 and a comparison text in Haggai 1:1, who somehow came into an audience with God. In a coronation ceremony, one would presume in heaven, as it is in audience with God and his angels, attended by Satan, granting him supreme supernatural power over the universe in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 7. But such a scene hardly seems descriptive of any living person and would more readily be esoterically read as being about a celestial being named Jesus, as in fact we know it was, Philo of Alexandria having made exactly this inference. But he didn't really, who was given by God's supreme authority over the universe in defiance of Satan. And there he cites Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1-2. As it happens, the name Yehozadak means in Hebrew, Jehovah the Righteous. So one could also read this as Jesus, the Son of Jehovah the Righteous, and thereby conclude this is really Jesus, the Son of God. There's something to be said about how fluid the shared space between divine beings and humans is within this early Jewish world. It is not remotely unusual at all for early Jews to have imagined themselves in the presence of God. This happened all the time for ordinary people. We read extensively about these same sorts of encounters and the same sort of perspective within the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here, let's just take a look at one from many texts within the Dead Sea Scrolls which make this explicit. I'm going to read from the Choreot, that's 1QHA, column 11, starting in line 19 through line 23. I thank you, O Lord, that you have redeemed my soul from the pit and from Sheol of destruction. You have raised me to an eternal exaltation, that I may walk about on an unbounded plain, and that I may know that there is hope for the one whom you formed from the dust for the eternal counsel. And you have purified an iniquitous spirit from great transgression. The speaker here is speaking of himself as a human being, so that it may take its station with the host of the holy ones and enter into the community with the congregation of the sons of heaven. And you have caused there to fall to a man, an eternal lot with spirits of knowledge, to psalm your name in the community and to recount your wondrous acts according to all your works. So there is nothing remotely unusual about depicting Joshua and the prophet Zechariah in an audience with God and his angels. Like I said, this happened all the time. And there's no indication from this that this must mean they are celestial beings. No. People believed that this happened to them, and they wrote about it. The claim from Carrier is that Joshua, the high priest, is granted what he calls supreme supernatural power over the universe. And this is utter nonsense. Yahweh says to Joshua in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 7, if you walk in my ways and keep my charge, you will petition for justice in my house and administer my courts. I will permit you to consort with those who are standing here. God's basically telling Joshua that so long as he's righteous and performs his duties within the temple well, then he can wander about and commingle with the angels. That's all he's saying here. In the Septuagint, it says, I will give you a place among those who are standing here. According to Carol and Eric Myers, this priestly access to the divine council is innovative. Previously, only prophetic figures, including Zechariah in verses 1 and 5, are portrayed as present in the council scene. Not even kings had access to the divine council. The expanded role of the priest with respect to judgment necessitates his becoming privy to God's judgment, which is often represented in biblical parlance by the heavenly court, an important aspect of the function of the divine council. Just as the prophet, as God's messenger communicating God's judgment concerning Israel to the people and especially to the king, as the official ultimately responsible for the carrying out of justice, so now the priest must execute justice and thus needs to have access to divine will. In the absence of a monarch in Yahud, therefore, it is quite understandable how priests, and especially the high priest, came to assume more and more judicial power, judicial earthly power, importantly. There is nothing at all about supreme supernatural power over the universe here. This is natural human authority to rule, pronounce judgment, and to administrate the state. That is all. So Carrier concludes, if this Jesus had ever been connected in previous but now lost Pesherim with the dying Christ figure in Isaiah and Daniel by linking them through Zechariah 3 verses 8 to 9, then we would have a man who dies and is then named rising and said to rise, just like Michael the Prince in Daniel, in order to be given all power and authority, which would imply a resurrection more than sufficiently to almost any Jew of the day, and who somehow conclusively atones for all sins in a single day. This is the flimsiest of webs. An imagined dying Christ figure in Isaiah and Daniel linked through Zechariah chapter 3 verse 8 to 9, which features no dying Christ figure, no cosmic power, and no comprehensive atonement. Remember, the atonement is limited to this land. That's it. And all within a lost Pesher, the plural of which, by the way, is Pesharim, not Pesherim, which Carrier would know if he knew any Hebrew. There's none of this in this text, and the suggestion that it's there is just completely off. It's wrong. From Zechariah 3 and 6, Carrier then moves on to discuss another of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the so-called Aramaic Son of God text, or 4Q 246. He says this: the Christian religion could thus, in a sense, be explained as an attempt to explain away Daniel's failed prediction of a divinely supported military victory for Israel over its Gentile oppressors, which continually didn't happen, by imagining, unlike Daniel, a spiritual kingdom instead of an actual one, and repeatedly postponing the actual one to an ever-receding future. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, in what's called the Son of God text 4Q246, we have a redaction of Daniel, in which it is predicted that one day a great and righteous man will be born and will be called the Son of God and rule an eternal kingdom. Though here it is still imagined as a kingdom achieved by conquest, followed by an eternal reign of peace, it's an easy thing to explain the failure of this to happen time and again by relocating that conquest into the spiritual realm. The identity of this figure who's called the Son of God is something that's still hotly debated, but even beyond his failure to mention any of that, Carrier still just gets some of this text flatly wrong. So, once again, let's take a look at the text. This is 4Q246, fragment 1, column 1, 1, through to column 2, 4. And column 1 is quite fragmentary, so we only have snippets of what's going on at the end of each line. It begins, something rested upon him. He fell before the throne, and then there's a break. O king, into the world rage is coming, and your years, and then another break. Your vision and all is coming unto the world, and a break. Amid great signs, misery is coming upon the land, and a break. And slaughter, a prince among the satrapies, and a break. The king of Assyria and Egypt, and another break. To be ruler over the land, and a break. They will serve and all will be subject, and the final break at the beginning of the last line of this column. And it continues. His son will be called the Great. By his name he will be named. He will be addressed Son of God, Son of Elyon they will call him. But like meteors in the vision, so will be their kingdom. A few years they will reign over the land, while people tramples people and satrapy tramples satrapy, until the people of God arise. Then all will have rest from the sword. Now, first of all, I want you to note that there is nothing about the birth of this figure who will be called the Great One. By this name he will be called. He will be called the Son of God, the Son of Elyon, they will call him. There's nothing about his birth in this text. Second, the indication that this figure will be righteous is really conjectural. Explicitly, in the very next sentence on column 2, it says that this kingdom, which is ruled by this figure and presumably his father, the king, will be, quote, like the falling stars in the vision. Some years they will rule over the land, but all the people will trample one another. Province will trample province until the people of God arise, and then all will have relief from the sword. It seems quite possible that this is not a good place to be, and maybe this isn't such a good guy. Scholars have debated whether this is a righteous Jewish leader. Is it a foreign oppressive king or representative of the people of Israel as a whole? So this figure is not clearly a righteous son, and there's no birth. The eternal kingdom of peace is also debatedly not his. The righteousness and the eternal kingdom belong to the people of God, which appear in the text which follows, starting in column 2, line 5 through 9. Here's what it says. Their kingdom is an eternal kingdom, and all their paths are righteous. They will judge the land justly, and all nations will make peace. Warfare will cease from the land, and all the satrapies will pay homage to them. The great God is their ram, or their strength. He himself will make war on their behalf, delivering peoples into their hand, overthrowing them all before them. Now, I need to point out here in my translation of the text that there is some confusion between the subjects in this second part because of the interchange between plural and singular verbs and pronominal suffixes. Is this with reference to the ruler of the people of God, or is this the people collectively? Groups in Hebrew and Aramaic are often treated as an aggregate. We actually see this a couple of times explicitly within this section of the text. The people of God rise up, which is all a singular construction, but referring to a group. Likewise, it says that all will make peace, which is expressed in the singular. But either way, it seems like there is a distinction being made between this kingdom from that of the king and his son named by his name. As some have suggested, could this be an Antiochene ruler? Antiochus III was called the Great, and his son Antiochus IV was called Epiphanes, which means God manifest. This is an idea that was first forwarded by J.T. Millick, and it was argued with some persuasion by Ed Cook. The people of God in this text seem most obviously to be the Hasmoneans. So most scholars have not adopted Millick's and Cook's view of this figure, and they view him as messianic, but it's still very unclear whether this is collective of the people of Israel or with reference to an expected Davidic king of the last days. In other words, it's complicated, but you would never know that from Carrier's trite description. So this brings us to the end of this video and to this short series of videos, and I have a handful of concluding thoughts. So something I've noticed in the book and in Carrier's blog posts, Carrier continues even in his responses to me to neglect actual quotations of texts or scholarly works in favor of his own summaries or even just mere references. Now, one of the first things that I learned in grad school was to accurately and carefully restate the arguments and ideas forwarded by my conversation partners, those who I agreed with and those whom I was challenging. But Carrier has this consistent habit of neglecting to do this altogether. There are multiple instances in just this small section from chapter 4 where he provides bibliographic support for an idea, but the article or the book reference does not at all align with the point he's making. There's an example of this in his discussion of 11Q13. My friend, Marty Abegg, who is a brilliant philologist and an expert in Hebrew syntax, wrote an article in 1994 titled Messianic Hope in 4Q285. And Carrier cited this article, which supposedly supports his assertion of a more specific notion of a dying Messiah in 11Q13. Here is the only thing Marty says about that text in his article. Given the concentration both before and after line 18 on the one who brings good tidings and comforts the mournful, that Daniel 9:25 and its heralding of the coming of an anointed prince 7 weeks after the rebuilding of Jerusalem is to be preferred to the reference of his being cut off in 9:26. In fact, the entire point of Abeg's article is to argue against the idea of a messianic figure, the Nasi Ha'edah, the prince of the congregation, in 4Q285 fragment 7, being killed in the last days, and he rather convincingly suggests reading the verb in question as a hiphil with a third masculine singular pronominal suffix. He, that is, the prince of the congregation, will kill the king of the Kittim. And this entire article completely undermines the point Carrier is attempting to make. And I'll point this out again, that the argument that Marty is making in this article is something that Carrier could follow if he knew even just basic Hebrew, but he doesn't. All that to say, Carrier's citations are not to be taken at face value, and I don't have the time or the wherewithal to check them all. I mean, who has the time for that? But in the few that I have taken the time to look at carefully, many times, they just don't even come close to saying what he implies they are saying. I have no doubt that Carrier and his acolytes will also complain that I haven't read the entire book, which was never my intention in the first place. I will remind you, my interest is in his handling of Jewish literature, which does not comprise the contents of his entire book. And even if I didn't get to every Jewish text he references, I think I've done enough to show clearly that he doesn't know what he's doing here. And if his appraisal of this literature is so poor, then it should give everyone significant concern about how useful the rest of the book even is. Pointing out his errors does not require a peer review article because most of these errors are of the elementary variety that all of us who specialize in Judaism learn to avoid in grad school. So finishing up, let's take a look at those review questions that I posed from the start of this series. Does Richard Carrier understand the early Jewish literature that he references? I have to say no. He doesn't read them in their original languages. He does not comprehend their handling of what they consider to be scriptures. And he doesn't understand their historical placement nor the shape of Judaism that they attest to. Has Richard Carrier accurately presented this literature? Definitely not. He almost never quotes primary texts. He frequently mistranslates words, he ignores grammar, and he fails to recognize reconstructional issues in a fragmentary text like 11Q13 or in 4Q246, the Son of God text. Do these texts meet Richard Carrier's own burden of proof, what any theory of the origins of Christianity must fit and take into account? So I would say an accurate understanding of these texts makes sense of the rise of Christianity from elements of Jewish messianism, but in view of the actual tragic death of an actual historical Jesus. But I don't think they work on multiple levels to support Carrier's theory of Christian origins because of the litany of errors that I've pointed out. Does Richard Carrier read and represent the literature well? No. I think Carrier is actually an astonishingly poor reader of these ancient texts. Is this book on the historicity of Jesus a good source of information on early Judaism? Absolutely not. Carrier's understanding of Second Temple Judaism, early Judaism, I would say is especially anachronistic. It's more akin to how evangelical Christians strawman early Judaism. So this is all I have to say, or will ever have to say, about Richard Carrier's work. He will no doubt continue to vomit multi-thousand word screeds in response to these videos, on top of the thousands of words of petulant bitching the tiny-fisted keyboard warrior blogger has already written and delivered to his microscopic audience of fomenting patrons. You are welcome to it, Richard. For my part, I will continue to ignore you. I'm Kip Davis. Thanks for watching.